The potamus clamped down. She overheard Mark telling another kid on the playground, "I'd take Zeus over God in a one-on-one any day." This earned him another hour of detention, though no meeting this time with the principal or mom, which Mark took as a sign that their will was weakening. They made him memorize prayers and recite them aloud in class. It was to everyone's delight, though no surprise to Mark, when they discovered he excelled in this form of repentance. The boy possessed a beautiful speaking voice. Anna was thrilled when she learned about this from Sister Mary Martina. They agreed he should be encouraged, and Anna not so secretly hoped Mark would someday become a priest. In what was temporarily perceived as a breakthrough moment, Mark surprisingly requested the opportunity to recite scripture for a church congregation. The youngest priest in the parish, Father Sean, heard about this request, and he championed the cause. The other priests agreed, so Mark was chosen to recite the 23rd Psalm in front of the entire student body, faculty, and those parents who could attend during a Friday morning Mass in late May, celebrating the feast of St. Philip Romolo Neri. This saint and priest apparently loved to read psalms aloud when he was a boy, and had a beautiful voice others loved to hear. He was also reputed to have foretold the exact hour of his death. Mark prepared with conviction and thoroughness. He read for his mother repeatedly, but refused the invitation to rehearse with the rest of the family. He sensed Paul knew his true feelings, and Mark didn't want to encounter his brother's skepticism without being able to bury it in a crowd. Mark reveled in the attention he received in the days before the event. Priests, nuns, and especially mothers sought him and offered praise, encouraging words, and tidbits of advice. His classmates weighed in with their own opinions. Those carried far more influence on Mark. As any kid will tell you, in school you are either a cool kid or a geek. You could vacillate a little between the two, but basically you were one or the other. Mark was an athlete. The bad kids were cool and the good kids were geeks. That's the way it was everywhere. This caused greater conflict for Mark than any moral dilemma over religion. He didn't want to be good or bad, cool or geek. Whatever direction he went, he only wanted to know the way he chose was right. The rest would take care of itself. He wanted to be popular, but only on his own terms. This was radical thinking, and Mark knew his own process was heavily influenced by his circumstances. His home environment was extremely restrictive, and he spent most of his waking hours with people cloaked in black. He was expressly forbidden to look like or do any of the things associated with kids who were at the time considered cool. No long hair, no ratty clothes, just the same uniform day after day, and absolutely no questioning of authority. So, he was a geek. But that was unacceptable. So he rebelled against many things in school, including kids who were cool or geek. One was just as bad as the other, and they both lacked originality and imagination, and religion was the worst. Of course, Mark's classmates knew where he stood on God, and that was very, very bad. So, he was cool. Suddenly, with this church recital opportunity, Mark felt he could walk both fences simultaneously, and in ways real and symbolic, bridge the gap between the two worlds. And yes, he did actually think all those thoughts, and in the most naive and ideological sense, he believed them to be true. But in truth, his motivation was much more simplistic. There was a girl in his class named Beth, and he had a crush on her. Beth's father was from Texas, and she spent time there visiting relatives, so they shared something in common. One day at lunch, they also discovered they both learned to ride horses in Texas. Until Mark became a father, Beth was the only person he ever told the entire story about learning to ride. They talked about other stuff too, and her smile made his toes wiggle. He just wanted to impress her, and sometimes it seemed he did. And make no mistake, she was cool. It was to her Mark dreamed and looked forward to reading the psalm. He wanted to be in front of everyone, with all eyes, ears, and opinions focused on him, so she could see what he looked like and sounded like at that moment. In this way, perhaps he could earn a few more moments of her precious time. It was really no more than that. But as the day drew closer, contradiction grew within his mind and heart. He realized the challenge lay not in the recitation, but in dealing with the consequences and the danger of setting a precedent. To pull it off, Mark would have to feign total allegiance to the dogma, and many people in the church would place trust in his faith. Some of his classmates offered cautious encouragement. They were anxious to see if he could get through it with a straight face. Others insisted he would fold, and a few were confident he'd find a way out of the whole thing. During a fire drill the day before the Mass, when the entire school gathered on the all-blacktop playground, the potamus glided her way through the lines of children and whispered in Mark's ear, "I just want you to know, I'm not buying what you're doing for 1 minute. But I am certainly enjoying you settle into your own trap." Though her methods were always cruel, she spoke the truth. Her intention, without question, was to gloat, but the inescapable honesty of her words was impossible to ignore. Mark wanted to say something profane and insulting, because she deserved nothing less. But before he responded, with futile vulgarity, and ended the hoax right there, a violently ill classmate lunged and careened blindly toward the boys' bathroom. This was not just any boy, but the mostly geometric block known as Caveman. He was one of 15 children, born to the same mother and father. They all looked alike, and they were all built alike, and they all smelled alike. Because there were so many of them, others in school would sometimes go home smelling a little like them, and it harkened back to a time and land of mostly still water. One or several of them were always sick and at school, while the well ones were mistakenly kept home, and it was said no one really knew the difference. Caveman, however, was special. When he moved, he was a bowling ball peen hammer. He was short, so he'd ram his shoulders into the midsection or lower and simply crumple and mow over the prone body. But this day, he was really sick, so he moved with powers even beyond his usual inevitable grace. Caveman smashed into Mark, fell atop his stunned body, and exhaled deeply into his face. Caveman managed to rise and stagger on through a suddenly clear path afforded by his fleeing classmates. He almost made it to the front door of the school before explosively vomiting into the bike rack. Mark remained on the ground, the wind knocked out of him, gasping for air from the force of the blow and the toxic fog he'd inhaled with his last breath. There was the briefest image of a slaughterhouse, and then he saw the puffy facial features of the potamus leaning over him. She stared straight into his eyes, and only Mark saw her joy while she announced to the other children, "Stand back, everyone. Give him air. We want him to be fine for tomorrow." That night, on the eve of the Mass, Mark began vomiting just after 6 o'clock. He ate half a Polish sausage and 2 bites of boiled cabbage before the entire ordeal burst forth from his body. The night was spent in fevered rhapsody between the bed and the bowl. No decision would be made as to his ability to read until the morning. At dawn, there was barely anything left of him. He'd cried and moaned, poured and gagged, spit, hated, and begged. He'd done overtime in his duty. And in that darkest hour, when his mother at last surrendered to sleep and left him to battle with nothing more than his own devices, Mark O'Byrne had an epiphany. He saw the truth, and he knew he was right. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he recognized clean, pure truth. Though he was a long way from healed, he immediately felt better. Anna entered the room and and asked how he was doing. Mark answered weakly, "I'll be fine." She stroked his dry forehead and asked if he wanted something to eat. He managed a slight smile and responded, "Maybe later." She stroked his head several more times and then asked if he thought he would be able to speak. He looked at her and hoped she'd understand. With strength and assurance, he answered, "Not today, Mom. Some other day, but not today." Anna smiled, kissed him on the cheek, and proudly whispered, "Sensible boy. Get some rest." For the first time all night, he did. As soon as his breathing deepened and his eyes remained closed, she began and completed a rosary. When he awakened 4 hours later, there was a bowl of oatmeal ready for him and his freshly washed and ironed uniform. She said, "Get ready for Mass." Before Mark protested, she declared, "Everyone will understand you're too ill to speak, but they need to see how sick you've been. Couldn't you just tell them?" He countered weakly, "That wouldn't be enough," was all she said, and he knew she was right. So Mark slipped into his uniform that felt almost 2 sizes too big and went to church. The congregation was already inside when they entered the huge wooden doors in the back and walked down the center aisle to the front pews. Anna turned them both to face the entire crowd. Mark stared without seeing the assembled faces, while Mom looked from side to side at those front pews, waiting to see who would offer their seats. It was no less than the Potamus herself, who at last reluctantly rose and moved to the only open seats remaining in the far back of the church. Sister Mary Peter Potamus had brought her 4th grade class 20 minutes before any other classes arrived. She wanted to be in the front row. She instructed her class to read quietly from their Bible. She took the seat closest to the center of the right side and bowed her head in prayer. But she miscalculated where the other classes would be sitting and was the only adult in either of the front rows. Not even her drawn veil protected her from having to give up her seat. Mark smiled warmly at her and with as much strength as he could summon announced, "Thank you for being so kind, Sister Mary Peter Grace." Then he leaned forward and gave the old nun a hug while breathing deeply and contagiously into her face. Almost everyone in the church heard and saw this, and most were touched by the seemingly genuine and conciliatory display of appreciation. Some were even amazed because they knew the history between these two. It was obvious Mark was ill, and impressive to everyone that he climbed out of his sickbed to be there. Caveman stayed home. Even the most cynical classmates admired the style of Mark's solution. As Mark and Anna sat down, and the Potamus reluctantly retreated to the back of the church, Anna whispered in Mark's ear, "I told you she'd be sorry." As he sat smiling and wavered slightly in his pew, Mark knew this was no more than a dramatic temporary reprieve, but he enjoyed the attention, especially the sweet and mischievous smile he got from Beth. Beyond attention or respite, or his very ungodlike revenge, Mark knew he'd discovered something far more important. He'd discovered the truth, and the truth was right. He completely accepted his own responsibility in the matter and knew he'd have to be more careful in the future. In the meantime, he could relax and enjoy the freedom that comes with acceptance of the truth being perfect.